The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy, though if you asked me, Vex 947, it looked more like a gathering of frightened herbivores than the most powerful governing body in known space. And trust me, I'd seen plenty of frightened herbivores in my time as a diplomatic observer. The humans have… What? Chancellor Krell's voice cracked like a pubescent Xanthari trying to impress his nestmate. His four eyes blinked in rapid succession, a clear sign that his brain was struggling to process what he'd just heard. Ambassador Keth from the Valorian Empire cleared his throat, producing a sound remarkably similar to a dying vacuum cleaner. They've declared the upcoming Sector 7 conflict AI sporting event, complete with commentators, betting pools, and apparently something they call halftime entertainment. Oh, this was rich. Absolutely rich. Here we were, trying to manage a territorial dispute that could potentially destabilize three-star systems. And the humans had turned it into what they called a game day experience. I had to admire their audacity, even if it made everyone else's scales itch with anxiety. Sporting event? Representative Mora from the Gentle Collective squeaked, her translucent wings fluttering so fast they created a small windstorm. But people will die. Ships will be destroyed. How can they possibly treat warfare as entertainment? I couldn't help but laugh, which came out as a series of clicking sounds that made half the council flinch. "Oh, sweet naive Mora," I said, leaning back in my observation pod. "You clearly haven't studied human history. These are the same beings who used to throw people to lions for fun, remember? The same species that invented gladiatorial combat before they even figured out basic space travel." Chancellor Krell's primary head turned toward me, his expression suggesting I'd just announced my intention to eat his offspring. "Vex 947, this is hardly the time for your… commentary." "Actually, I think it's exactly the time," I replied, accessing my datapad with a casual swipe. "Because while you're all sitting here clutching your emergency inhalers and wondering how to deal with this unprecedented situation, I've been doing what good observers do. I've been watching." The holographic display flickered to life above the chamber's center, showing footage from the human military staging area. And what a sight it was! Instead of the grim, militaristic atmosphere you'd expect from a species preparing for battle, the scene looked more like a festival. Colorful banners fluttered in the artificial breeze. Vendors sold what appeared to be food items shaped like tiny starships, and soldiers posed for pictures with civilians wearing matching jerseys. "By the Seven Suns," whispered Trade Minister Volk, his usually steady voice wavering like a broken subspace transmission. "They've got cheerleaders." Indeed, they did. A group of humans in matching outfits performed synchronized movements while chanting something that roughly translated to "Defense! Defense! Make them bleed!" in standard galactic common. It was both horrifying and oddly mesmerizing. Commander Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Force, the display showed a human male with what appeared to be ritual scarring on his face, though my cultural database suggested these were actually called smile lines, tells our reporter that morale has never been higher. Quote, "We've been training for this matchup all season. The hegemony thinks they can just waltz into our territory. Time to show them what Earth's finest can do. This is gonna be one hell of a game." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear Chancellor Krell's breathing apparatus wheeze with each intake. Finally, Ambassador Keth found his voice. Did he just refer to a potential interstellar war as a game? "Oh, it gets better," I said, scrolling through more data. "They've established something called a Fantasy War League, where civilians can draft real military units and earn points based on combat performance. Apparently, the winner gets a year's supply of something called pizza and bragging rights. Representative Mora looked like she might faint, which for a gaseous being was quite an achievement. This is madness. How can they be so casual about violence, about death? Because, my dear fluorescent friend, I said, unable to keep the amusement out of my voice, you're dealing with humans. The same species that invented extreme sports like base jumping and volcano surfing during their industrial period. The same beings who considered juggling chainsaws a legitimate career path. Chancellor Krell's secondary mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water. But surely their leadership must see the gravity of the situation. Surely someone in their government understands that this isn't some primitive arena contest? I pulled up another data stream, this one showing the human government's official response to the Council's concerns. President Elena Vasquez, a woman whose smile somehow managed to be both reassuring and terrifying, addressed the camera with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd eaten apex predators for breakfast. The Galactic Council's concerns about our approach to the Sector 7 situation are noted and appreciated, she said in a tone that suggested she found their concerns about as relevant as yesterday's weather report. However, I want to assure our allies that the Terran Defense Force is fully prepared to handle this matter with all the professionalism and enthusiasm it deserves. We've beaten tougher opponents before, and we'll do it again. Earth doesn't back down from a challenge. Did she just call a potential war a challenge? Trade Minister Volk's voice had risen to a pitch that made my auditory sensors wince. "Oh, that's nothing," I continued, thoroughly enjoying myself now. "Wait until you hear about their pre-battle ritual. They call it a pep rally. Apparently, the entire fleet command staff gathered yesterday to sing something called their fight song, while consuming vast quantities of fermented beverages. The holographic display shifted to show exactly that. Human officers in full military regalia, arms linked, swaying back and forth while bellowing what sounded like a war chant. The lyrics, when translated, seemed to involve something about their enemy's maternal lineage and their own superiority in various forms of combat. Ambassador Keth's diplomatic composure finally cracked completely. "They're singing! They're actually singing before going to war!" "Not just any singing," I corrected, accessing more files. "According to my sources, it's a traditional Earth military song called We Are the Champions by an ancient musical group known as Queen. Apparently, it's considered essential pre-combat preparation." The council chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives shouted in 17 different languages. Several species began their panic rituals, and at least 3 diplomats appeared to be experiencing what humans might call nervous breakdowns. Through it all, I sat back and watched with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of observing the absurdities of interspecies relations. "Order! Order!" Chancellor Krell's voice boomed through his amplification system. "This is a crisis of the highest magnitude. How do we even begin to respond to such enthusiasm?" I suggested helpfully. "Insanity!" Representative Mora shrieked, her gaseous form flickering with stress patterns. "This is complete insanity! They're going to get themselves killed! They're going to get everyone killed!" "Actually," I said, bringing up another data stream that made everyone freeze, "that's where things get really interesting. Because while you've all been focused on their attitude, you've completely missed the most important part." The display showed tactical readouts, fleet compositions, and strategic analyses that I'd compiled over the past week. Numbers that told a very different story than the festival atmosphere suggested. The humans aren't just treating this like a game because they're crazy, I explained, watching as understanding slowly dawned on several faces. They're treating it like a game because they've already won. Chancellor Krill's 4 eyes focused on me with laser intensity. What do you mean? I mean, dear Chancellor, that while their opponents have been preparing for a conventional military engagement, the humans have been preparing for what they do best. I highlighted specific sections of the tactical data. They've turned warfare into entertainment because they've already calculated every possible scenario. They know their enemy's capabilities, they know their own advantages, and they know exactly how this is going to end. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional, nervous clicking from the arthropod delegation. Look at these numbers, I continued, feeling rather like a teacher explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow students. The hegemony has superior numbers, better technology, and more experience with conventional tactics. On paper, they should win easily. But the humans aren't fighting on paper. Trade Minister Volk leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. Then what are they fighting on? Psychology, I said simply. Fear, confusion. The absolute bewilderment that comes from facing an opponent who treats your most serious efforts like a recreational activity. I switched the display to show intercepts from Hegemony Communications. The translation software struggled with some of the emotional concepts, but the general tone came through clearly enough. Listen to this, I said, playing back a particularly illuminating exchange. Hegemony Fleet Commander Zorth Prime, speaking to his tactical staff. How do we fight an enemy that appears to be enjoying this? Our psychological warfare specialists are baffled. Every intimidation tactic we've employed has been met with what their translators describe as laughter. One of their captains actually thanked us for making things interesting. The silence stretched like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. Oh, but it gets better, I continued, really warming to my theme now. Yesterday, the humans sent a formal diplomatic message to the Hegemony Fleet. Want to guess what it said? Nobody answered, but their expressions suggested they were afraid to find out. It was a dinner invitation, I announced. Apparently, Commander Morrison wants to take the Hegemony leadership out for something called barbecue after the battle is over. Win or lose, he said. No hard feelings. Ambassador Keth made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so tinged with hysteria. They invited their enemies to dinner? Standard human post-game tradition, according to my research, I confirmed, though I suspect the invitation might have been slightly sarcastic in nature. Slightly? Representative Mora's voice had reached frequencies that were causing interference with the chamber's communication systems. Well, I admitted, the exact wording was, "Hey Zorth, looking forward to showing you why they call us apex predators. Hope you brought your appetite, because we're about to serve you a 5-course meal of kinetic destruction with a side of tactical superiority. Dinner's on us afterward, assuming you survive dessert. XOXO, Commander Jake Morrison, P.S. My grandma makes better war plans than your strategic division, and she's been dead for 30 years. The collective intake of breath from the assembled delegates could have powered a small space station. Chancellor Krill's voice came out as barely more than a croak. They insulted the hegemony's strategic capabilities while simultaneously offering hospitality? Multi-layered psychological warfare, I explained. Classic human strategy. They insult your competence, threaten your existence, and invite you to share food afterward. It's the diplomatic equivalent of being punched in the face by someone wearing fuzzy mittens. But surely, Trade Minister Volk said desperately. Surely the hegemony won't fall for such obvious manipulation. I pulled up the latest intelligence reports with the kind of smile that would have made a Terran shark proud. Oh, my dear naive friend, you clearly don't understand the first thing about psychology. The hegemony is absolutely falling for it. They're so confused by the human approach that they've started second-guessing everything. The display showed intercepted hegemony tactical discussions, and they were beautiful examples of an enemy defeating themselves. Listen to Fleet Admiral Kresh 7, I said, playing back another recording. Perhaps this confidence indicates secret weapons we are unaware of. Perhaps their casual attitude suggests reinforcements we have not detected. Perhaps their invitation to share food after battle indicates cultural practices involving the consumption of defeated enemies. Wait, Representative Mora interrupted. They think humans are going to eat them? Apparently, the concept of barbecue doesn't translate well into hegemony linguistic protocols, I explained. Their cultural specialists have concluded that humans are planning some sort of victory feast involving the ritual consumption of enemy flesh. The laughter that burst from my voice box was probably inappropriate for the setting, but I couldn't help myself. The best part? This has actually improved human morale even further. When Commander Morrison found out that the enemy thinks they're planning to eat them, he supposedly said, and I quote, "Boys, looks like we're about to serve up some grade A terror with a side of psychological sauce. Let's give them something to really chew on." As the first part of what promised to be the most entertainingly lopsided conflict in galactic history continued to unfold, one thing became abundantly clear. Someone had seriously underestimated exactly what kind of species they were dealing with, and that someone was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the dangers of picking a fight with beings who had turned warfare into their favorite hobby. 72 hours later, the Galactic Council chamber resembled what I imagined a mental health facility might look like during a mass breakdown. Half the delegates were heavily sedated, the other half were frantically updating their insurance policies, and Chancellor Krell had developed what appeared to be a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch every 3 seconds. "Status report," he managed to croak through his breathing apparatus, though it sounded more like a death rattle than an official request. I stretched languidly in my observation pod, savoring the moment. "Well, Chancellor, the good news is that the conflict is proceeding exactly as predicted. The bad news is that nobody predicted this." The main display flickered to life, showing real-time footage from the battle zone. What we saw defied every military textbook ever written in the history of galactic civilization. The human fleet had arranged itself into what appeared to be a party formation, with their flagship broadcasting music across all communication frequencies. "Is that?" Ambassador Keth squinted at the display, his voice filled with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for witnessing impossible physics. "Are they playing musical accompaniment to their own battle?" "War March No. 5 by Earth composer Ludwig van Beethoven," I confirmed, checking my cultural database. "Apparently chosen by popular vote among the crew. The runner-up was something called Eye of the Tiger, but Command felt it lacked sufficient dramatic flair for opening engagement." Representative Mora had given up all pretense of diplomatic composure and was openly weeping, her gaseous form flickering with what I recognized as existential terror. "They're not even taking cover. Look at them!" Indeed, the human ships were flying in formations that any sane military commander would recognize as absolutely suicidal. Open wedges, exposed flanks, and what appeared to be completely voluntary clustering around their command vessel. It was like watching someone juggle plasma grenades while riding a unicycle. Commander Morrison is currently broadcasting on all channels, I reported, pulling up the audio feed. Quote, "Attention Hegemony Fleet. Welcome to what we humans call a turkey shoot. For those unfamiliar with Earth fauna, turkeys are large, stupid birds that can't fly very well. We'll let you figure out the metaphor. Game time, boys." Trade Minister Volk had turned an interesting shade of purple that I didn't think his species was capable of achieving. How are they not dead yet? Ah, excellent question, I said, switching to tactical analysis mode. Because while everyone was watching their theatrical performance, nobody bothered to scan for the real preparations. The display shifted to show sensor readings that painted a very different picture. What had looked like suicidal positioning was actually the most sophisticated tactical web I'd ever seen. Each human ship was positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, and escape vectors that turned their apparent vulnerability into the galaxy's deadliest trap. "Sweet nebular gases," whispered Ambassador Keth. "They've turned themselves into bait." "Not just bait," I corrected. "They've turned themselves into bait that happens to be bristling with enough firepower to crack a small moon. Notice how their seemingly random clustering actually provides optimal firing solutions for their main batteries? How their exposed positions are actually hardened kill zones with redundant shield generators." Chancellor Krill's twitching intensified. "But the hegemony has twice their numbers. Superior technology. Battle-tested commanders." "Had," I corrected gently. Past tense. Because while the hegemony was busy being confused by human psychology, the humans were busy being human. The battle footage rolled forward, showing the moment when Fleet Admiral Kresh 7 made his fatal mistake. Interpreting the human formation as evidence of incompetence, he ordered a full frontal assault designed to quickly crush what he assumed were amateur commanders playing at war. "Watch this part carefully," I advised the Council. "This is what humans call a teachable moment." The hegemony fleet swept forward in perfect battle formation, disciplined and professional. Their approach was textbook perfect, their tactics sound, their execution flawless. It was exactly what any competent military commander would do when facing such an obviously inferior opponent. Which was exactly why it failed so spectacularly. "First wave impacts in 3, 2, 1. I narrated, watching as the hegemony's pride collided with human ingenuity. The result was breathtaking. As soon as the hegemony ships entered optimal firing range, the human formation simply wasn't there anymore. Ships that had been clustered together suddenly spread into attack positions with precision that would have made a ballet instructor weep. Weapons that had been powered down roared to life. Shields that had appeared minimal blazed at maximum strength. "Impossible," Trade Minister Volk breathed. "Those maneuvers should have taken minutes to coordinate." "Only if you're not human," I replied, pulling up the communication logs. Listen to their tactical chatter during the engagement. Commander Morrison to Alpha Wing. "Johnson, remember that thing we practiced with the frisbee and the beer cans?" Response from Alpha Wing leader. "Roger that, boss. Frisbee maneuver Charlie on my mark." Followed by what I can only describe as enthusiastic whooping sounds. The display showed the impossible. Human pilots executing complex tactical maneuvers using references that made no sense to anyone but them. Apparently, years of competitive sports, recreational games, and what they called holding our beer and watching this had created a shared tactical language that was incomprehensible to outsiders, but devastatingly effective. "They're treating it like a game because they've gamified warfare itself," I explained to the stunned Council. "Every maneuver, every tactic, every strategic decision has been turned into something they practiced for fun. They're not fighting a battle. They're playing the ultimate version of every competitive activity they've ever invented. The hegemony's perfect formation crumbled like a sandcastle in a tsunami. Ships that had expected to face incompetent enemies found themselves outmaneuvered by pilots who thought like athletes, outgunned by crews who treated accuracy like a sport, and outfought by commanders who planned battles the way they planned championship games. Fleet Admiral Kresh 7 is requesting immediate reinforcements, I reported, scrolling through intercepts. His exact words, and I'm translating loosely here, were, "These beings fight like they're possessed by the spirits of war itself. They anticipate our movements as if they can read our thoughts. How do we combat an enemy that treats our best efforts like a recreational challenge?" "But surely," Representative Mora managed between sobs, "surely they'll make mistakes, get overconfident, let their guard down." I pulled up the latest human communications, grinning in a way that probably should have been illegal in 14 systems. Captain Sarah Burke, of the TDF Relentless, to Commander Morrison. "Jake, the enemy commander just tried that flanking maneuver we saw in last week's tactical review. Want me to show him why we call it the rookie mistake?" Morrison's response, "Light him up, Sarah. But remember, we promised not to embarrass them too badly in the first quarter." "First quarter?" Chancellor Krill's voice cracked completely. "Human sporting terminology," I explained helpfully. "They've divided the battle into segments, just like their traditional games. They're currently winning 23-3 in what they call ship-to-ship eliminations, though I'm not entirely sure what the scoring system represents." The tactical display updated to show the current state of the engagement, and it was. Well, it was educational. The hegemony fleet, once a proud armada of disciplined warriors, was being systematically dismantled by opponents who had apparently choreographed their own victory. "Look at this maneuver," I said, highlighting a particularly impressive sequence. "The humans call it the Statue of Liberty play. Watch as the TDF horizon appears to retreat, drawing 3 hegemony cruisers into pursuit. Now observe as the TDF Liberty emerges from behind that asteroid, having used the gravitational field to slingshot into perfect firing position. The enemy ships are caught between hammer and anvil, with nowhere to run and no time to respond." "How did they coordinate that timing?" Ambassador Keth asked weakly. "According to the tactical chatter, they've been practicing it during their recreational time using asteroid racing and something called cosmic billiards. The pilot of the Liberty apparently learned the maneuver while competing in what humans call extreme sports competitions." The Council watched in horrified fascination as the human fleet continued its systematic demolition of hegemony pride. Every attack was perfectly coordinated, every defense precisely timed, every maneuver executed with the kind of casual precision that comes from turning deadly skills into entertainment. "Commander Morrison is hailing the hegemony flagship," I reported, bringing up the communication feed. "This should be interesting." The display showed Morrison's face, still wearing that insufferably confident smile. Behind him, his bridge crew was celebrating what appeared to be a particularly successful play, complete with high fives and victory dances. "Fleet Admiral Kresh 7, Morrison said, in the tone of someone addressing a particularly slow student, "I hope you're enjoying the game so far. I have to say, your opening strategy was pretty much exactly what our War College uses as an example of outdated thinking. But hey, you gave it your best shot." The response from the hegemony flagship was a mixture of outrage and confusion that my translation software struggled to process. The general meaning seemed to involve questioning Morrison's parentage, his sanity, and his understanding of proper military protocol. Morrison's grin widened, Now, Admiral. No need for trash talk. Though I have to admit, your tactical deployment reminds me of something my nephew drew when he was 7. Very colorful, lots of enthusiasm, but maybe not quite ready for the big leagues. He's giving them tactical criticism, Trade Minister Volk observed in wonder. In the middle of battle. Educational outreach, I corrected. Very human. They genuinely seem to believe that crushing someone completely is more satisfying if the victim understands exactly how thoroughly they've been outplayed. The final phase of the engagement was almost anticlimactic. The hegemony fleet, demoralized, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly humiliated, began broadcasting surrender requests on all frequencies. Their proud armada had been reduced to scattered remnants in less than 4 hours, and they'd barely managed to inflict cosmetic damage on the human formation. Total casualties, I reported to the stunned council. Hegemony forces, 87% fleet destruction, complete tactical defeat, total loss of strategic initiative. Human forces, minor shield damage to 3 vessels. 1 reported injury when a crew member sprained his wrist, celebrating too enthusiastically. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for funeral services. And now, I continued, savoring the moment, comes the really interesting part. The display shifted to show Morrison's ship moving toward the crippled hegemony flagship. But instead of delivering a finishing blow, it extended docking clamps and began rescue operations. "What are they doing?" Representative Mora whispered. "Exactly what they said they would do," I replied. "They're inviting the survivors to dinner." Within hours, the human fleet had transformed from a battle formation into what could only be described as a floating festival. Medical ships tended to hegemony wounded, supply vessels distributed food and emergency supplies, and somehow, impossibly, the humans had set up what appeared to be an impromptu celebration, complete with music, food, and interspecies cultural exchange. The final communication from Commander Morrison to the Galactic Council was perhaps the most human thing I'd ever witnessed. Council leadership, mission accomplished. Sector 7 is secure. The hegemony has agreed to respect territorial boundaries, and we're throwing a victory party. Fleet Admiral Kresh 7 turns out to be a pretty good sport, and he's got some interesting stories about his homeworld's military traditions. Oh, and he wants to know if we'd be interested in setting up some kind of military exchange program. Apparently, his younger officers are fascinated by our tactical innovations. Who knew that ultimate frisbee techniques would revolutionize space combat? Anyway, we'll file the official report later. Right now, we've got barbecue to serve and new friends to make. Morrison out. As the council sat in stunned silence, I leaned back in my observation pod and reflected on what we'd just witnessed. The humans hadn't just won a military engagement, they'd turned warfare itself into a form of diplomacy. They'd crushed their enemies so thoroughly and so entertainingly that the survivors wanted to join them for dinner and learn their secrets. "So," I said to the assembled delegates, "anyone still think the humans don't understand the gravity of interstellar conflict?" Nobody answered. But then again, what was there to say? We'd just watched a species turn the most serious business in the galaxy into a recreational activity, and somehow, impossibly, make it work better than anyone had ever imagined possible. The humans, it turned out, hadn't been treating war like a sport because they were crazy. They'd been treating it like a sport because they were absolutely, terrifyingly, brilliantly sane. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening realization of all.